September 11th, 2023 started as an ordinary Monday afternoon for Judge Elena Vance. The circuit court judge had cleared her calendar early to head toward a community event, her mind focused on the evening's keynote speech. But at 2:07 p.m., the flashing lights of a patrol cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror, signaling the start of a collision that would change two lives forever. Officer Marcus Thorne, a man with over a decade of experience, pulled her over in a quiet residential neighborhood, claiming her taillight was out. It was a blatant fabrication. The bulbs were functioning perfectly, but Thorne wasn't looking for equipment violation. He was looking for a target. When Thorne reached the window, the air turned cold with a predictable tension. He demanded her license and registration with an immediate hostility that left no room for the professional courtesy usually extended during a standard stop. Vance, maintaining the poise of the bench, calmly asked for the legal basis of the encounter. She wasn't being difficult. She was exercising the Fourth Amendment rights she defended every day in court. Despite Vance explicitly identifying herself as a sitting judge, Thorne's ego remained unmoved. He saw a black woman in a car and made assumptions that would eventually destroy his life. He didn't care about her title or the law. He only cared about the blind submission he felt his badge commanded. As he ordered her to step out of the vehicle, he had no idea he was standing before the same woman who had recently sent 3 of his fellow officers to prison. Thorne thought he was in control, but he was actually standing on the precipice of a 10-year downfall. The atmosphere on the quiet residential street shifted from a standard traffic stop to a volatile battle of wills. As Judge Elena Vance stepped out of her vehicle, she didn't move with the frantic energy of a suspect. She moved with the deliberate, calm precision of a woman who had spent decades mastering the nuances of the law. She kept her hands visible and her voice low, a stark contrast to Officer Marcus Thorne, whose face was flushed with a growing, unchecked rage. Thorne didn't see the constitutional rights Vance was asserting. He saw her refusal to cower as a personal affront to his authority. He demanded blind, immediate submission, treating the roadside as his own personal courtroom, where he acted as both witness and executioner. Vance explicitly identified herself again, hoping the mention of her judicial office would act as a circuit breaker for Thorne's escalating hostility. "Officer, I am complying, but you are currently violating the Fourth Amendment," she stated, her words sharp and clinical. It was a clash of 2 different kinds of power, one rooted in the steady application of the law, and the other rooted in the raw, aggressive ego of a man who believed his badge placed him above it. Thorne's response was a sneer. He stepped into her personal space, his hand hovering near his holster, radiating a physical threat intended to break her composure. He was a veteran of 12 years who had grown accustomed to people folding under his gaze, but in Judge Vance, he had finally met a force that refused to bend. The dramatic irony deepened with every second. Thorne was so focused on winning the encounter that he failed to see he was systematically providing the very evidence that would lead to his own 10-year conviction. The verbal standoff reached a violent breaking point when Officer Thorne realized that Judge Vance would not be intimidated into silence. In his mind, the law was a tool for control, and Vance's insistence on her rights felt like a direct assault on his status. Without warning or provocation, Thorne abandoned all police protocol. He lunged forward, seizing Vance's right arm with a force intended to inflict pain rather than merely secure a suspect. As he violently twisted her limb behind her back to force her toward the car, a sickening pop broke the silence of the afternoon. The judge's shoulder had been forced out of its socket, sending a jolt of white-hot agony through her frame. Despite the clear medical trauma and Vance's audible gasp of pain, Thorne did not de-escalate. Instead, he interpreted her involuntary flinching as active resistance, a common tactic used by abusive officers to justify further violence. He shoved her against the hot metal of the sedan, his knee pressing into her back with a weight that made breathing a struggle. To the neighbors watching from their porches, it was a harrowing display of a veteran officer systematically dismantling a non-threatening woman. Thorne remained willfully blind to the reality of who he was assaulting, dismissing her judicial credentials as a fake story. He was so consumed by the need to dominate the moment that he ignored the red recording lights on his own chest and the smartphones held by the surrounding witnesses, every one of them capturing the felony assault that would soon transition him from a man of the law to a common inmate. As Judge Elena Vance lay on the blistering asphalt, her dislocated shoulder screaming in protest, the situation descended from an unlawful arrest into a scene of pure brutality. Officer Marcus Thorne stood over her, his shadow looming like a dark omen. He did not see a woman in physical agony. His eyes were clouded by a desperate need to reclaim the authority he felt he was losing. On the surrounding porches, the quiet of the afternoon was shattered by the clicks of smartphones as 7 neighbors began recording. They saw what Thorne's ego refused to acknowledge, a compliant woman being systematically broken. Thorne's hand went to his belt, but he bypassed his handcuffs. In a move that violated every department policy regarding a non-violent subject, he drew his X-26 taser. "Stop resisting," he bellowed, a command that served only as a hollow justification for the recording devices nearby. Vance was motionless, her face pressed against the grit of the road, yet Thorne stepped forward and pressed the electrified barbs directly into the small of her back. The trigger pull unleashed 50,000 volts of high-voltage, low-amperage electricity. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. Vance's entire body went into a state of neuromuscular incapacitation. Her spine arched involuntarily, and a guttural, strangled cry escaped her throat as every muscle in her frame seized at once. The 5-second cycle felt like an eternity, but Thorne wasn't finished. Despite her being completely incapacitated and surrounded by witnesses shouting for him to stop, he cycled the weapon a second time. The double deployment sent a second wave of agony through her already traumatized nervous system. Thorne stood back, watching the judge's body twitch on the pavement, seemingly satisfied that he had finally achieved the submission he demanded. He didn't know that with every pulse of that electricity, he was adding years to his own future sentence. The neighbor's footage, capturing the blue arc of the taser against the judge's back, was already being uploaded to the cloud, ensuring that this moment of unchecked power would be the very evidence that would lead to his 10-year downfall. The siren's wail was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence as Marcus Thorne hoisted a limp, handcuffed Elena Vance off the pavement. By the time the transport van arrived at the local hospital, the adrenaline that had fueled Thorne's rage was beginning to cool, replaced by a flickering shadow of doubt that he tried to suppress with a scowl. He marched into the emergency room, still projecting the persona of a hard-nosed officer who had just secured a dangerous suspect. He checked Vance into the secure wing, her head lolling against her chest and her dislocated shoulder visibly distorted beneath her torn blouse. The atmosphere in the ER shifted instantly when Dr. Julian Reed stepped through the trauma bay curtains. A veteran physician who had spent hundreds of hours in courtrooms as an expert medical witness, Reed froze the moment his eyes met the patient's face. He didn't see a resisting suspect. He saw the woman who had presided over his expert testimony just 3 weeks prior. "Judge Vance?" he whispered, his voice cutting through the clinical hum of the room. He turned to Thorne, his expression hardening into one of pure, professional condemnation. "Officer, do you have any idea who this woman is? Why is a sitting circuit court judge in handcuffs and covered in taser burns?" Thorne's face went pale, his practiced bravado finally beginning to crumble. He stammered about a traffic stop and non-compliance, but the medical staff was no longer listening to his justifications. Dr. Reed ignored Thorne's protests, ordering the immediate removal of the restraints to treat Vance's injuries and stabilize her breathing. Within 10 minutes, the hospital's head of security and the on-call administrator were in the room, their faces grim as they took in the scene. By 20 minutes, a call had been placed directly to the chief of police, bypassing the usual chain of command entirely. Thorne stood in the hallway, a solitary figure suddenly realizing that the walls of the untouchable world he had built for himself were falling down. The revelation was out. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had assaulted a pillar of the legal system, and the medical records being typed up at that very moment would become Exhibit A in his own criminal trial. The digital floodgates opened less than 24 hours after the assault. What Marcus Thorne had envisioned as a routine, undocumented exercise of power became the most scrutinized video in the country. A neighbor's cell phone footage, captured from a high-angle porch, was the first to hit social media. It showed a clear, unobstructed view of Thorne pressing the taser into Judge Elena Vance's back while she lay immobile and defenseless. By the following morning, the video had amassed 10 million views, trending under hashtags that demanded immediate accountability. The public wasn't just seeing a traffic stop, they were witnessing the systematic torture of a high-ranking judicial official. As the outrage reached a fever pitch, a local news investigative team successfully sued for the release of Thorne's own body camera footage. The high-definition audio and video provided a chilling front-row seat to the officer's internal state. It captured his fabricated lies about the taillight, his dismissive sneer when the judge identified herself, and the terrifying click-clack of the taser being cycled twice against a non-resisting subject. The juxtaposition was undeniable. Vance was a portrait of legal poise, while Thorne was a man unraveling into lawless aggression. National civil rights leaders and the governor held a joint press conference, calling the footage the most definitive evidence of police brutality in a generation. The viral fallout acted as a catalyst for a swift institutional purge. The police department, which had initially released a vague statement about following protocol, was forced into a humiliating retreat as the digital evidence contradicted every word of their initial report. Protests gathered outside the courthouse where Vance presided, not to demand her release, as she had already been cleared, but to demand that Thorne face the maximum penalty allowed by law. The narrative was no longer in Thorne's control. Every news cycle dissected his 12-year history, uncovering a trail of previous complaints that had been buried by a system that was now being forced to account for itself. The stage was set for a trial that the entire world would be watching, and for Thorne, the 10-year prison sentence was beginning to look like an inevitability rather than a possibility. The federal courtroom was a portrait of somber formality, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence on the asphalt months prior. Marcus Thorne sat at the defense table, his once crisp police uniform replaced by a dark suit that seemed to hang off his shrinking frame. Across the aisle, the prosecution team prepared their opening salvo. They didn't need to rely on emotional pleas. They had the cold, digital memory of the event. As the lead prosecutor hit play on the large monitors, the courtroom watched in a heavy, stifled silence as Thorne's own body camera betrayed him. The prosecution's strategy was surgical. They synchronized the neighbor's porch footage with Thorne's audio, creating a multi-angle timeline of the assault. Every time Thorne's defense attorney tried to argue that his client felt threatened, the prosecutor would pause the video on Judge Vance's still, prone body. "Is this the posture of a threat, Officer Thorne?" the prosecutor asked, her voice echoing in the hallowed hall. The defense's narrative of a dangerous encounter withered under the weight of the high-definition reality. The jury watched Thorne's face on the screen, the sneer, the arrogance, and the total disregard for the identification Vance had provided. The most damning moment came when the prosecution introduced Thorne's disciplinary file, which had been unsealed for the trial. It revealed a 12-year history of aggressive escalation and complaints that had been consistently dismissed by his superiors.
The trial wasn't just about one afternoon, it was about a decade of unchecked power finally hitting a brick wall. When Judge Vance took the stand to testify, she didn't speak with anger, but with the steady, terrifying clarity of the law itself. She recounted the moment she felt her shoulder pop and the excruciating surge of the taser, her testimony painting Thorne not as a protector, but as a predator with a badge. By the time the prosecution rested, the air in the room felt thick with the certainty of a conviction.
The jury's deliberation lasted less than 3 hours, a remarkably short window for a case involving a veteran officer of the law. When the 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom, the air was thick with a heavy, expectant silence. Marcus Thorne stood at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the mahogany bench. As the foreperson read the word guilty on all counts, including civil rights violations and felony assault, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Thorne's invincibility, a shield he had worn for 12 years, shattered in an instant. He was no longer the hunter. He was the convicted. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed once more for the final sentencing. Judge Elena Vance sat in the front row, her arm still in a medical sling, her presence a silent testament to the gravity of the proceedings. The presiding judge, a colleague who had watched the viral evidence with the same horror as the rest of the nation, did not mince words. He spoke directly to Thorne about the sacred nature of the public trust and the irreversible damage caused when a badge is used as a tool of terror. "You did not pull over a suspect," the judge stated, his voice echoing in the hallowed hall. "You targeted a citizen, ignored the law you swore to uphold, and engaged in a calculated act of brutality." Then came the sentence that sent a shockwave through the local police union: 10 years in federal prison. It was the maximum penalty allowed under the sentencing guidelines, a figure chosen specifically to serve as a warning to any officer who believed their authority was absolute. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of tears and applause as Thorne was led away in handcuffs, the very same steel restraints he had once used to humble those he deemed beneath him. For the first time in his life, Marcus Thorne was on the other side of the bars, facing a decade of reflection for the 5 minutes of rage that had defined his legacy. The 10-year verdict wasn't just a punishment for one man. It was a landmark declaration that in a courtroom, the law is the only true power. The aftermath of Marcus Thorne's conviction did not just mark the end of one man's career. It became the catalyst for a seismic shift in the city's legal landscape. While Thorne began his 10-year sentence in a federal facility, now a prisoner of the very system he once thought he owned, the city of Baltimore moved to settle the civil lawsuit filed by Judge Elena Vance. The resulting $3.8 million settlement was record-breaking, but the financial figure was secondary to the structural mandates attached to it. Under the terms of the agreement, the police department was forced to submit to independent civilian oversight and a total overhaul of its use of force training, specifically targeting the ego-driven escalation that Thorne had personified. The Vance reforms, as they came to be known, led to the immediate demotion of the supervisors who had previously buried complaints against Thorne, signaling that the era of the blue wall of silence was finally crumbling. The body camera footage of the assault was integrated into academy curriculums nationwide, serving as a definitive case study in the catastrophic collision of prejudice and authority. It was no longer just a video, it was a mirror held up to the face of law enforcement, demanding they see the human rights they were sworn to protect. 1 year to the day after the flashing lights first appeared in her rearview mirror, Judge Elena Vance returned to her bench. The physical scars had faded and the medical sling was gone, but her commitment to the letter of the law had only deepened. In her first case back, she presided over a matter involving police misconduct, her voice steady and her gaze unwavering.
She spoke from the bench about the sanctity of the public trust and the heavy burden of the badge, her words carrying the weight of someone who had survived the system's darkest impulses. The story of the veteran cop and the judge he didn't recognize ended not just with a prison sentence, but with a legacy of transformation. As Marcus Thorne sat in a cell reflecting on the 5 minutes of rage that cost him his life, Judge Vance stood before a new generation of law students, teaching them that the law is not a weapon of the powerful, but a shield for the targeted. She remained a living testament to a hard-won truth, that while prejudice may hold the taser, justice ultimately holds the gavel.
If you found this story of justice and accountability powerful, don't let the conversation end here. This case serves as a stark reminder that no one is above the law and every voice matters in the fight for reform. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Judge Vance's stand against corruption, please like and subscribe. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on more gripping stories where the truth is uncovered and the system is held to account. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new chapter.